you know, the question is, what would justify that? I think if we're invited in, sure. You know, consensual Chapter 6 sort of preventive intervention, absolutely. Both sides want to do it. It could very well work. In fact, my Rwanda book, the big conclusion was that the only thing that could have really saved the majority of the targets would have been if we had significantly enhanced the peacekeeping force that was on the ground prior to the outbreak of genocide. In fact, the Belgians were asking for that, and the US rejected it at the UN. But what about non-consensual preventive military intervention? It seems to me that you would have to have a very, very high bar for that legally and morally. It also seems to me very unlikely that many countries would have the political will to launch such an intervention. We have a tough time building the will to intervene even when we're seeing the atrocities on TV. How are you going to build the will when there aren't any atrocities happening?
I think it sounds like that.
I'm sorry?
I think it sounds like that. There's no pictures, but there's still some indication of something that could have happened with no intervention.
Well, there are pictures. There are pictures of civilians suffering. Right? And there's pictures of people in hospitals, and there's pictures of charred bodies. So there are pictures. What there aren't pictures of are deliberate, large-scale massacres of civilians. But I would contend that it's those pictures of the hurt civilians that are what help trigger the political will for intervention. So, but you're arguing for intervention, I think, preventively even before that point. And I think that would be very hard. And as I say, it's legal and moral barriers or ethical barriers, but I think also political barriers. So, you know, yes, if we had a crystal ball and infinite political will, then I think I would align myself with your proposal. But I don't think we have a crystal ball. I don't think we have infinite political will. So I think it's theoretically interesting, but practically not implementable. That's my personal opinion. Peter? Peter Lee.
A question for Alan. Very compelling argument you present. Really a practical question. In the year before a presidential election, what is your opinion of the likelihood that President Obama will go on television to sell to the American people, we are going to give Gaddafi a pension, safe passage, and immunity from prosecution to save the lives of thousands of Libyans? I see that as a Scotsman who's a bit embarrassed. Sorry, guys.
Or tenure at the postgraduate school.
Yeah. I want to know if Scotland is going to throw into jail for the rest of his life the person who defected from Gaddafi's regime, Moussa Koussa, and is turning over intelligence against Gaddafi. That's going to be an interesting moral quandary. Huh?
Send him to Texas.
So, no, but I think there's a way out here, which is that, you know, well, we'll just execute him. That's what we do. No, you know, the fact that Gaddafi, I recommend President Obama should seek asylum for Gaddafi and arrange it doesn't mean that he has to take credit for it. So I think what would happen is that he would get on TV and announce that the African Union has arranged asylum in the same way that you know, this is what occurred for Charles Taylor in Liberia in 2003. That's another case that I've written up in a chapter for a book, actually a Navy book from Naval Postgraduate School. And it's one of the great success stories. It's unsung because it happened almost it's the same year that we invaded Iraq, so everyone paid attention to Iraq. No one paid attention to Liberia. But this was a classic golden parachute for Charles Taylor. We were instrumental in making it happen, but it's like, no, the Nigerians gave him asylum. So I would suggest a similar sort of.
You always get a dodgy doctor who's terminally ill.
Okay, thanks.
David?
Yes, for Alan, I mean, so I think I agree with a lot of what you were saying. And I mean, it kind of chimes with what I was trying to say yesterday about Libya, that our job shouldn't be to be picking winners, and we certainly shouldn't fall into the trap that the enemy is the bad guy is the good guy, which is clearly not right. But I worry that you're parodying responsibility to protect a little bit. I mean, after all, the stuff about intervention is only one component of what they see as a three-part step. There's a lot of material about the responsibility to monitor monitor the internal processes within countries that are at risk of atrocity. So I think that helps to ameliorate some of the dilemmas that you're indicating. And I mean, just in terms of the recommendations that you had, which I thought were really helpful, I wondered whether one other might be to say that in situations where there is an armed insurgency, which the government is addressing militarily, whether the international community can use the threat of intervention, or as you put it, the guarantee of not intervening. Not only, I mean, you said we should send a signal we won't intervene as long as the government is responding proportionately. But that seems to me to put the bar too low. I mean, it's not that just that you want them to respond in a militarily proportionate manner. You also want to open up the space for a non-violent political solution. So what you might do in the case of an insurgency that's trying to secede is you say, we'll provide a guarantee of non-intervention and maybe even offer of support against the armed insurgents, provided there is movement towards a political process, for example, a referendum on secession or some opening up of that political space. So you balance on the one hand the attempt to constrain politics through atrocity, by on the other hand trying to open up a space for that non-violent, peaceful politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I'll have to think about whether I think it rises kind of to the level of a sixth recommendation that's specifically about implementation of the R2P. It may well do so. I certainly agree with you. I mean, I certainly agree that at the same time that we should not have intervened militarily in Libya, we should have been trying to negotiate a peace agreement. And so maybe I consider it to be implicit, and maybe I should make it explicit. So I thank you for that recommendation. As for the R2P and how much there is there in terms of the other things besides robust intervention. And so I'm quite familiar with Gareth Evans's work, and I've debated him on radio, TV, and print on these things, and I'm familiar with the three different, there were three parts to the R2P when originally proposed in 2001, and then they changed it. Now there's three parts to the R2P that are three different parts. There's always three parts, but they're totally different now. But in any case, and Gareth says it's like a layer cake. You can either take the layers individually or you can cut a slice, okay, or three slices, so fine. I actually think they're totally different, but it's okay. The question is, how much there is there in terms of being different from the norm of humanitarian intervention from the 1990s? And I would argue that, in fact, the only thing that's of great significance is this question of when people, civilians, are dying or a prospect of dying, will you intervene in the internal affairs of that state, including with military force, to save those civilians? Everything other than that, and I don't mean to minimize the effort that's gone into thinking about it, but I personally sort of think of it as a lot of window dressing for that key question. And I would refer you all to, there's a symposium that was just published, current issue of the journal Ethnopolitics. Gareth Evans has the lead chapter on R2P, and then 3 or 4 of us respond to that. And I think it's a very, very interesting sort of debate.
We have a queue in about 5 minutes, sir. Here next.
I want to thank you very much, Alan, for the things that you have to say. As a guy who led the first U.S. forces in Bosnia, my armor brigade rode 1,056 miles in 2 weeks, built a bridge, got in there. Led to the most rewarding year in my military career. However, I believe then and now that this notion of the right to protect has enormous possibility for unintended and very harmful consequences. You began to talk about that. I wonder if you expand on it. I mean, one of the things we got out of Kosovo, my second R2P event, was we ethnically cleansed Kosovo of all the Kosovar Serbs. And our policies produced greater Albania. And is that really what we want to do? What are some of the other unintended outcomes that you see potentially in your moral hazard argument?
Well, first of all, thank you for your service, and thanks to all of the members of the military for their service. You're absolutely right about that there are additional negative consequences potentially that I didn't mention. And one of them is not just that we exacerbate the atrocities that were happening in one direction, but there's very often what we do by helping the rebels is that we lay the ground for the reverse atrocities. And so we see that for sure in Kosovo, where after NATO troops had entered Kosovo, the ethnic Albanians did in fact cleanse the majority of Serbs from Kosovo to either northern Kosovo above the Ibar River or into Serbia proper. And if that weren't bad enough, then after NATO troops had been on the ground for 5 years, there was another pogrom by ethnic Albanians against Serbs while the UNMIK stood by and watched, essentially. So those sorts of things. And so I mean, I think that this arises in part because we have this notion that there's good guys and bad guys. And you know, it's a cliche to say there's no good guys. There's some better guys and better women and so forth. That's true. But partially, I think, for the political reasons, my Scotsman maybe will understand this. When you decide to intervene, at least the U.S., we have to paint it as the good guys versus the bad guys. And this is how somehow this motley crew of Libyans has become freedom fighters. Okay? The only folks that are fighting seriously with real will and willingness to die on the front lines amongst the rebels are Islamists, radical Islamists affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And they went to Iraq to kill Americans. They went to Afghanistan to kill Americans. They came home, right, and now they want to take over Libya. And I'm not saying that the majority of rebels are like that. I'm saying that's the vanguard. Those are the ones. So, but that's not what you hear from President Obama. Similarly, with this question, you know, he said, you know, Gaddafi said he was going to show no mercy to his people. We can't allow that. Well, I defy you to find where Gaddafi said that. He said he's going to show no mercy to the rebels in order to protect civilians. He said he would grant amnesty to any rebel who laid down his arms. He said he would grant free passage for any rebel outside the country to Egypt. He never said that he would show no mercy to his people. But the president keeps saying it, but it just ain't so.
Jean, next.
Yes, well, this takes us another direction. Dean, I wanted to throw something your way. Let me begin in this way. You know that for many of us, the notion of private contractors fighting in behalf of a nation's mission makes us a bit queasy. Maybe, you know, we've got echoes of Machiavelli in our heads about the danger of mercenaries and so on. You have to have thought about those kinds of objections. So would you share with us briefly what you think would be the strongest arguments against your view?
Yeah, thank you. And I think that a lot of the very real concerns that people have had with mercenaries in the past are about control. And
to whom are they loyal? And
right.
will they go to the highest bidder and so on and so forth?
Right. And
So how do you respond with concerns like that?
I just think that they're largely overblown, and I think that we can put in place mechanisms to ensure that, not ensure, but to minimize those concerns. So what I do in my book is I work through Peter Fever's a framework of civil-military relations. And what he talks about there, he says, you know, and it's maybe a little hard for Americans to grasp, but actually for a lot of military forces, there's this real concern that you can't control your military, right? Americans have forgotten that this is a problem, but it is in a lot of the world. And so what he does is he kind of sets aside those kind of moral norms that we take for granted and say, well, what else is there in order to ensure that military forces obey their civilian rulers? And there are a range of mechanisms that are available and that are often applied, and we have them here as well. And what I do in the book, and I won't go into the boring detail, but is kind of work through each one and say, well, is there any particular reason we couldn't have something like this for a contracted force? And I don't think that there is. So yeah, there are